Okay, let's do it. Quorum being present, the Committee on Homeland Security will come to order. Committee's meeting today for consideration of H.R. 4569, Counterterrorism Information Sharing Improvement Act of 2017, H.R. 4564, the Post-Caliphate Threat Assessment Act of 2017, H.R. 4581, the Screening and Vetting Passenger Exchange Act of 2017, H.R. 4578, the Counter-Terrorist Network Act, H.R. 4553, the Terrorist Screening and Targeting Review Act of 2017, H.R. 4555, the DHS Interagency Counterterrorism Task Force Act, H.R. 4433, the Securing Department of Homeland Security Firearms Act, H.R. 4577, the Domestic Explosives Detection Canine Capacity Building Act, H.R. 1486, the Securing American Nonprofit Organizations Against Terrorism Act, H.R. 4567, the DHS Overseas Personnel Enhancement Act, H.R. 4559, the Global Aviation System Security Reform Act, and H.R. 4561, the Security Assessment Feasibility for Equipment Testing and Evaluation of Capabilities for our Homeland Act. Chair announces that any requests for recording votes may be rolled, and he may recess the committee at any point. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the Subcommittee on Emergency Preparedness, Response, and Communications is discharged from further consideration of H.R. 1486, and the Subcommittee on Oversight and Management Efficiency is discharged from further consideration of H.R. 4433. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Committee has convened this morning to mark up 12 important pieces of legislation that will help to protect our homeland in several key areas. On Monday morning, the Islamist terrorists detonated a pipe bomb in a subway station in New York City. I was there that morning. And while no one was killed, this was just the latest reminder that our homeland is under constant threat and that we must make sure we're doing everything we can to keep Americans safe. Today we have an opportunity to amend and pass through our committee bills that will bring us closer to achieving that goal. Legislation we will consider today will help strengthen the capacity of canines to detect explosives at our airports, support nonprofits through grants for new security and inspection systems, conduct a review of our challenges across the global aviation system, and enhance CBP's ability to collaborate with federal, state, local, and tribal and international partners to improve border security operations. We will also review 5 bills that heed the recommendations of the Republican Task Force on Denying Terrorist Entry into the United States, led by Congressman Gallagher. America's enemies are constantly looking for vulnerabilities and areas of weakness to exploit and inflict harm. This holiday season, it is important that we remain vigilant in the face of any and all threats, and remember that we have thousands of patriotic men and women within the DHS who work every day to protect our homeland and keep us safe. Finally, this is the last full committee markup of the year, and I want to thank all of our members and their staff for their hard work throughout this 2017 year. I think we've accomplished quite a bit this year. In fact, we passed over 60 bills out of this committee, more than most committees in Congress. Unfortunately, 50 of those bills are sitting in the Senate and have yet to be acted on. And I would urge the Senate to take action, particularly on the Reauthorization Act that we passed out of this committee and passed out of the floor, and the bill that we passed yesterday or this week on the House floor, the reorganization of the MPPD, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency Act that singles out one single agency within the department to conduct cybersecurity. These, among others, are important, good governance, bipartisan bills that are simply sitting in the Senate. And I think it is absolutely irresponsible not to act on that legislation. And with that, I yield to my ranking member, Benny Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to extend my thoughts and prayers to the people of New York City and those affected by the Port Authority bus terminal explosion this past Monday. I also want to thank the first responders and law enforcement officers who quickly identified the suspect and took him into custody. However, this attack underscores the need for continued vigilance against acts of terrorism on U.S. soil and to redouble our efforts to bolster security for surface transportation and other critical infrastructure. I expect that today, as you've already indicated, will be the last markup for this year. Despite our jurisdictional limitations, we've managed to be productive legislatively in this Congress. I also would hope that you would talk to the Republican leadership, as you will on the Senate side, to do their work so some of what we do can become law. And I already have your word that you're doing that and will continue to do it. Also, we've advanced about 70 timely bills and important measures, including a bill to authorize DHS and this week a bill to reorganize and rebrand MPPD. There's still work to be done, though. Certainly, in light of the attack on public transportation in New York earlier this week, we should be considering Vice Ranking Member Watson Coleman's Surface Transportation and Public Area Security Act of 2017. We also should be considering H.R. 2514, a bill I worked with Representative DeFazio, a former member of this panel and ranking on energy, transportation, and infrastructure, to restore sorely needed monies for the passenger security fees to TSA to address emerging terrorist threats. In the days to come, I hope we can work together to prioritize consideration of these and other measures that have the potential of making a big impact on our nation's security. Turning to today's markup on the roster of 12 bills that address a wide range of Homeland Security concerns. Several of the bills on the roster codify activities that the Department of Homeland Security is currently engaging, while others seek to advance the department's operations, including an area that has been of great interest to me, DHS's overseas operations. I understand that many of these bills are the outgrowth of the committee's task force to prevent terrorists from entering the United States. Regardless of whether, in the end, members issue a bipartisan report, we're able to support these bills. I am particularly pleased that H.R. 1486, the Securing American Nonprofit Organizations Against Terrorism Act of 2017, is included on the roster. I included H.R. 1486 to authorize the nonprofit grant program to provide needed support to nonprofit organizations that are at risk of a terrorist attack. The recent uptick in threats and incidents against nonprofit organizations this year reflect a disturbing trend of ideologically based threats of violence against nonprofit organizations and substantiates the need for legislation to ensure that these communities are secure. H.R. 1486 seeks to do just that. If enacted, for the first time, at-risk organizations outside urban area security initiatives, UASI's jurisdictions, would be eligible for those terrorism preparedness and protection grants. The Securing American Nonprofit Organization Against Terrorism Act of 2017 is also endorsed by the Jewish Federations, who sent a letter to this committee in support of this legislation. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record this letter.
Without objection, so ordered.
I also want to thank you, Chairman McCall, for working with me on including language to formally authorize the Nonprofit Security Grant Program in the DHS Authorization Act, and for considering this important measure again today as a standalone bill in order to facilitate passage in the Senate. I'm pleased that this has been a bipartisan effort. As such, I urge President Trump to join us in our efforts to secure nonprofit organizations and places of worship and reject the hatred and extremism fueling the violent threats against, not embrace and excite it, as his recent retweeting of an anti-Muslim video and his inciting rhetoric has done. Finally, there are two other bills introduced by Democratic members that we will be considering today. I support H.R. 4578, the Counterterrorist Network Acts, introduced by Representative Vela, a strong proponent of the Customs and Border Protection National Targeting Center. It would codify the activities currently carried out by the National Targeting Center Counter Network Division. I also support H.R. 4433, the Securing DHS Firearms Act of 2017, authored by Representative Correa, to direct DHS to step up its efforts to safeguard department-issued firearms and other sensitive assets. Both measures are steps in the right direction of enhancing the effectiveness of DHS in fulfilling its mission to safeguard the homeland and the American people. With that, I look forward to considering all 12 measures before us today, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Gallagher, for an opening statement on the task force.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we destroy the caliphate in the Middle East, foreign fighters and terror sympathizers will continue to flee the battlefield and are looking for new ways to spread their hatred, recruit new followers, instill fear, kill innocent people, and disrupt our way of life. The bombing on Monday morning was the second terror attack in New York in less than 2 months, and a grave reminder of the reality of this threat, a grave reminder that this threat will continue to evolve, and so we must evolve as well to stay abreast of it. Given this current environment, we led a task force at the direction of Chairman McCall to identify specific national security challenges and examine how terrorists might infiltrate our homeland and bring harm to our people. Subsequently, we produced a report with a series of solutions to fix any identified weaknesses that may be exploited by our enemies. This report resulted in several pieces of legislation that we will consider, amend, and pass this morning. We worked very closely with our colleagues on the other side of the aisle. I understand that there is still not yet full agreement on the final draft of the report, and I just want to reiterate my desire to find a way forward, and I think my counterpart shares that desire, and as a result, I think it would be a shame if we can't come to an agreement. And so we will be releasing the report at the end of the day, and I just am hopeful that our minority colleagues will reconsider their decision, and hopefully can find a way to move forward, and I'm happy to stay here as long as humanly possible and work to get an agreement. So I would just want to thank everyone who worked hard on this task force, and I'm very pleased to see productive legislation emerging from it today. And again, I want to thank the chairman for his direction, his leadership. I also want to thank Mr. Katko for his example, having led a similar task force last year and helping us all along the way. And with that, I yield.
Gentleman yields. I also want to commend Mr. Gallagher for his leadership on the task force. It's a bipartisan task force. I would hope we could come together as a committee and issue the report in a bipartisan fashion. That's the way I always prefer to govern on this committee. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New Jersey, Ms. Watson-Coleman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for acknowledging me, and thank you to the chairman of the task force for bringing his comments before us today, and some legislation as he sees fit coming from that effort. As I stated when the task force on denying terrorists entry into the United States was established, keeping America safe is indeed a bipartisan concern. Democratic members are unwavering in our commitment to advancing policies to prevent terrorists by keeping dangerous individuals from traveling into this country. And this is why we are supporting some of the bills that are considered by the Committee on Homeland Security today. Unfortunately, however, we are unable to sign on this task force report as being released by the Republican members. While there were many areas of bipartisan agreement, differences were significant enough in other areas of the last version have proved too great to overcome and have thus prevented us from joining our colleagues on this document. For example, while Democratic members have long supported robust screening and vetting of individuals seeking to travel to this country, we cannot support efforts to further President Trump's misguided extreme vetting program or his un-American Muslim ban. Instead, Democrats want to push out America's borders by increasing the Department of Homeland Security's presence overseas, expanding vetting and screening programs like the pre-clearance, the Immigration Advisory Program, and the Visa Security Program, and enhancing information sharing among federal agencies and with our trusted foreign partners. Together, these initiatives will strengthen our security without undermining our values. Similarly, while we support the use of social media for screening and vetting visa applicants on an individualized, risk-based basis, we are concerned that overly broad collection of social media information would be counterproductive to security and privacy. Furthermore, Democratic members are concerned that the report is unduly focused on the security challenges facing Europe in particular, but rather than offering a holistic examination of the threats to the U.S. around the world. Democratic members are also concerned that the report includes findings and makes recommendations that are not supported by the task force's work. For example, while the task force conducted a site visit to U.S. Customs and Border Protection's National Targeting Center and the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Terrorist Screening Center, we did not receive information to suggest the TSA should be merged into the NTC as the report recommends, but we do support the bill before us that seeks to study the efficacy of this program and this movement. Doing so without having doing this study would have unintended consequences that undermine security. Going forward, it is imperative that we build on the progress that has been made since 9/11 by securing our country from terrorism in a way that also protects our rights and freedom. Keeping Americans safe and secure is our paramount concern. It is a bipartisan concern, and we remain committed to further enhancing security in a way that upholds this goal as well as our American values. And with that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Is there any further discussion on this issue? Mr. Gallagher is recognized.
Well, I appreciate my colleagues' concerns. We've done our best to listen to them and meet halfway. I wish these concerns would have been voiced at the staff level or at my level a long time ago. As for the concerns about extreme vetting, the language in the report on concurrent vetting is in accord with bipartisan action that has previously been taken by this committee this year, and I don't understand an attempt to portray it as anything other or outside of the norm. As for the concerns about privacy and social media, I share them. This, too, is in accord with past action taken on a bipartisan basis in the committee. And as for the concern that the report unduly focuses on Europe, well, I would say that any effort to push our borders out, as my colleague suggests, which I share that sentiment, well, that begins with Europe and a focus on Europe. We know we have approximately 6,000 foreign fighters that have gone to Syria with European passports, and I can think of no better place to begin pushing that border out than in Europe. And I will say one of the most powerful and detailed hearings, or not hearing, but a meeting that we held at the task force level was with our European colleagues. We had EU representatives, ambassadors from at least 4 different European states, and that was really a source of a lot of our analysis. But rather than debate all of the specific issues, I just would say, you know, I was a staffer for a couple years on a national security committee. I know how this process works. You know, you go back and forth, one side red lines, the other side red lines, the red lines, and it can be frustrating. I spent 2 months of my life negotiating an overhaul of assistance to Egypt that went nowhere. But I just would say, if it rather than walk away, offer an alternative, and I'm sure we can meet in the middle. And I just would express my desire to move forward on a bipartisan basis, and I fully respect and appreciate the concerns of the other side, and want to make sure that we address them and move forward, and I'm committed to doing that. So thank you. Yield.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion? Ms. Watson-Coleman is recognized.
Thank you, and I certainly thank the chairman of the task force committee for his observations regarding our observations. I think there are a couple of things that I have to say. While there may be issues that have been put forth in this proposed task force report that we have interest in, I don't think those issues were necessarily covered in the very few interactions we had with the task force. We actually had one roundtable, one 40-minute committee meeting, and one other committee meeting, and we had 2 site visits. And I don't think that the work that we did supports the expanded consideration that's set forth in the proposed task force. And I simply am saying that we will look through all of the transcripts of all of the hearings that we've had with regard to this issue. We want our recommendations, our findings to be limited to what we heard, what we saw, what we were briefed on, not what we might know from some other work that was done in this area. And if anything, I suggest that it might beg the question as to whether or not we should have had more engagement for this task force. And with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. A year ago, we issued a bipartisan task force report, which led to many bills being passed on the House floor after the Paris attacks. I know that the task force took a trip overseas and studied the issue very diligently. I can only hope that we can come together on this report, as we usually do as a committee, in a bipartisan fashion. With that, I think it's time to move on unless there's any further discussion. By agreement between the chair and ranking member, the committee by unanimous consent shall use an amendment roster today.
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking member is recognized.
Reserving the right to object, and I will not object, would the chair please explain our agreement regarding the amendment roster? I yield to the chair.
And I thank the gentleman, all committee members, for agreeing to the use of this roster. We've agreed that the bills be open to amendment at any point, and then we shall take up amendments in the order listed on the roster. The chair will allow members to offer amendments listed on the roster out of order to the extent practicable and in a manner not prohibited by the House or committee rules. Amendments not listed on the roster may be considered at the conclusion of consideration of the roster. Additionally, it's my understanding there's a bipartisan agreement on the number of bills and amendments thereto. Accordingly, the chair will be asking unanimous consent to consider those bills en bloc at the beginning of the markup in the interest of time. Members with bills included in the en bloc will still be recognized for statement on their bills.
Thank the chair for this explanation and withdraw my reservation.
I thank the ranking member. I ask unanimous consent now that H.R. 4564, H.R. 4569, H.R. 4578, and H.R. 4581 be considered without objection to order. I
think we got out of order.
Okay. Is that right?
Yep, those are the first 4 bills.
I think we got.
Okay.
We got 45, 50, 45.
Okay.
You doing the second on board?
No, we did the second first. Okay. Okay, I think we have this worked out, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And H.R. 4581 be considered without objection to order. The clerk shall designate the bills.
H.R. 4564, H.R. 4569, H.R. 4578, H.R. 4581.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. The bills were circulated in advance and printed copies are available. No amendments were pre-filed. Does any member have any amendments to these bills? Hearing none, I ask unanimous consent that H.R. 4564, H.R. 4569, and H.R. 4578 and H.R. 4581 be ordered to be reported to the House with a favorable recommendation without objection. So ordered. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. I now recognize the sponsors of the measures just approved. The gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, is now recognized for a statement on his bill, H.R. 4564.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today I'm offering H.R. 4564, the Post-Caliphate Threat Assessment Act of 2017, for committee consideration. My bill directs the Secretary of DHS to coordinate with the Secretary of State and Director of National Intelligence to conduct a threat assessment of foreign terrorist fighters, their activity, and report their findings to Congress. An estimated 30,000 to 40,000 foreign fighters traveled to ISIS-occupied territories to join the Islamic State's now defeated and disbanded caliphate in Iraq and Syria, leaving behind scores of thousands of battle-trained radical Islamic terrorists, unidentified and their location unknown. Foreign jihadist fighters planning to attack our homeland may seek to exploit direct flights to the United States or take advantage of the visa waiver program or the ill-advised diversity lottery visa program. My bill will ensure that Congress and the executive branch harvest accurate data on foreign terrorist identity, location, and travel. It is our sworn oath to defend America, and I urge the committee to vote in favor of this legislation. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Gallagher, is recognized for a statement on his bill, H.R. 4569.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Counterterrorism Information Sharing Improvement Act seeks to enhance the current information sharing environment that exists within the federal and military communities. Throughout our task force, we heard time and again about the incredible amount of biometric and biographic data being pulled off battlefields in Syria and Iraq as U.S. forces and our allies continue to roll back the territories once held by ISIS. It's often DoD personnel that encounter ISIS on the fighters on the battlefield, which often leads to collection of valuable data. However, if these fighters or their associates move back to the West or try to enter the U.S., DHS becomes the primary entity that will engage them. Therefore, it's critical that the data recovered by DoD in the battlefield is able to reach DHS and its systems for effective frontline screening and vetting of known or suspected terrorists. So in order to verify we're utilizing this information to support our counterterrorism efforts, we must ensure that the Department of Homeland Security gets access to this data in a timely manner, particularly so that it can be used for screening and vetting purposes. My bill directs the President, acting through the Secretary of Homeland Security, to ensure that DHS has access to biographic and biometric data collected by the U.S. government on individuals associated with a terrorist organization. This bill also directs the Secretary to report to Congress on these efforts. I think it's fair to say the U.S. must prioritize any opportunity to identify bad actors outside the country and expand our ability to identify and deter threats before they reach the homeland. Unfortunately, information sharing challenges among U.S. agencies can prevent valuable information from becoming available for frontline screening and vetting. Not only is this a bureaucratic challenge, given the number of separate government agencies and components involved, but legal, capacity, and technical issues exist as well. And so this bill will address this challenge and create improved synergies between the Department of Homeland Security and its other federal and military partners. And I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Vela, is recognized for a statement on his bill, H.R. 4578.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As members of the Committee on Homeland Security, we are all aware that waiting to mitigate security risks until they reach our borders is too late. I introduced H.R. 4578, the Counter-Terrorist Network Act, which will support U.S. Customs and Border Protection's efforts to expand its presence abroad to prevent individuals who pose as a known threat to our country from entering the United States. CBP's National Target Center, or NTC, uses the latest technology and analytical tools to identify threats and share that information with our law enforcement partners, both domestic and international. By taking a sophisticated and targeted approach, the NTC and other overseas CBP operations are able to contribute to federal and international efforts to prevent terrorist and transnational criminal networks from operating with impunity. H.R. 4578 authorizes the NTC to continue building its collaborative intelligence and law enforcement partnerships to ensure that we stay one step ahead of those individuals who wish to do us harm or commit other criminal acts. The bill also authorizes CB personnel to be posted abroad to perform critical preemptive operations to make sure the travelers and visa petitioners coming to our country are thoroughly screened and vetted. Mr. Chairman, it is imperative for DHS and its law enforcement partners to do everything practicable to screen and vet individuals before they arrive at our borders. H.R. 4578 continues underscoring this imperative by authorizing CBP to counter terrorist and criminal networks' efforts to infiltrate our borders in a way that has proven effective and adaptive. I thank my co-sponsors, Ranking Member Thompson, Congressman Katko, Congresswoman Watson-Coleman, for their support, and I urge my colleagues on this committee to also support this bill. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fitzpatrick, is recognized for a statement on his bill, H.R. 4581.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I urge all of our colleagues to support H.R. 4581, the Screening and Vetting Passenger Exchange Act of 2017. This important legislation directs the Secretary of Homeland Security to develop best practices for utilizing passenger information and passenger name record data for counterterrorism screening and vetting operations. It also directs the Secretary to make the best practices available to visa waiver program countries and provide assistance to those countries in implementing these best practices. As an FBI agent, Mr. Chairman, I saw firsthand the dangers that terrorism poses to our friends, our families, and our communities, especially when traveling. And I also saw my colleagues in the Bureau and across our nation's security and intelligence agencies hampered in their mission by a lack of information sharing between the United States and our allies, and when other countries abided by less stringent security and vetting protocols. Allowing our women and men on the front lines of the fight against terrorism to work with visa waiver program countries to make sure that they rise to the same standard only increases the safety of our nation, the safety of Americans traveling abroad, and the safety of all people across the globe. This legislation is a step in the right direction towards addressing further potential emerging threats. Once again, I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 4581, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. I ask unanimous consent that H.R. 4553, H.R. 4555, and H.R. 4433 be considered without objection. So ordered. The clerk shall designate the bills.
H.R. 4553, H.R. 4433, H.R. 1486.
Without objection, reading is dispensed with. I ask unanimous consent that the amendments be pre-filed, listed on the roster, included in the member packets, be adopted, that H.R. 4553, H.R. 4555, H.R. 4433 be ordered to be reported to the House with a favorable recommendation as amended. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, Mr. Garrett, Mr. Rutherford, and Mr. Correa may be recognized for 5 minutes on their legislation, and Ms. Jackson-Lee may be recognized for 5 minutes on her amendments. Does any member seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, briefly.
Mr. Rutherford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As terrorists and foreign fighters in Iraq and Syria seek to return home or travel to other regions in the wake of the defeat of ISIS on the battlefield, cooperation among the U.S. military, national security, and law enforcement agencies is vital. H.R. 4555, the DHS Interagency Counterterrorism Task Force Act of 2017, will assist in creating that cooperation and coordination. When these fighters move from the Middle East to the West or other regions, information collection and tracking becomes extremely difficult, especially for ensuring that relevant federal agencies all have access to the same critical information. An enhanced whole-of-government effort to share information and intelligence related to these fighters and their movements would improve security of the homeland. In order to achieve this, Bill H.R. 4555 authorizes the Secretary to assign DHS personnel to overseas agency counterterrorism task forces to facilitate counterterrorism, information sharing, and combat threats stemming from overseas sources of conflict or terrorism. This will enable DHS to build on existing initiatives to co-locate DHS personnel with other federal departments and agencies, and that will play a crucial role in the fight against terrorism. For example, assigning DHS personnel to the Department of Defense locations would better facilitate collection and sharing of information recovered from conflict zones, which significantly improves our ability to interdict terrorists before they seek entry into the country. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank you for allowing this important bill to be brought forward before the committee today, and I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Correa on his bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In 2010, the Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General reported almost 300 firearms issued by DHS were lost in a 2-year period. The majority of the losses occurred because firearms were not properly secured, which was a direct result of the lack of department-wide firearm policy. This past October, the Inspector General again reviewed this issue and again reported that personnel still did not properly safeguard firearms and other sensitive assets. As a result, between 2014 and 2016, DHS reported 230 firearms lost, almost 2,000 badges, and 25 immigration stamps also lost. Robust and standardized department-wide requirements and safeguards and reporting of lost firearms is an administrative matter that's both important to public safety and to Homeland Security. Lost firearms have been recovered by from suspected gang members and individuals in possession of drugs. In 2015, in my home state of California, 27-year-old Antonio Ramos was fatally shot with an ICE agent's stolen 9mm pistol. My legislation seeks to establish effective department-wide safeguards and controls over firearms and sensitive assets when they are issued to DHS officers. This amendment under consideration today makes technical changes that reflect feedback from DHS about the underlying bill. Under this legislation, the Department's Undersecretary for Management must issue a department-wide directive that includes requirements for securing DHS-issued firearms and other assets, as well as reporting and record-keeping of lost assets. This bill also makes training and guidance on how to adhere to safeguards of, and in the event of lost firearms requirement. H.R. 4433 is a step in the right direction. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Garrett's recognized on his bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm speaking briefly today on H.R. 4553, the Terrorist Screening and Target Review Act. What this bill does is really streamline government, which is something we should all aspire to do. It eliminates unnecessary redundancies that are also costly to the taxpayers. In the terrorist screening realm, it also acknowledges the realities of lessons that should have been learned well on September 11, 2001, insofar as we think perhaps had we been able to amalgamate all of the information held by various agencies and then process that information, that we might have known sooner and had a better opportunity perhaps to prevent the loss of life. This deconflicts information sharing. In fact, it mandates such information sharing and ensures the most efficient, cost-effective, and safe way to defend our homeland against those who would seek to do us harm. I would also commend my colleague, Ms. Jackson Lee, for her amendment with which we are in full concurrence. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the bills? Mr. Perry's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I speak in support of H.R. 4433, the Securing Department of Homeland Security Firearms Act of 2017, offered by my colleague and friend, Mr. Correa, the gentleman from California. H.R. 4433 will require DHS's Undersecretary for Management to promulgate a department-wide directive to DHS personnel aimed at improving the security and tracking of DHS firearms and other sensitive assets. According to a recent report by DHS, the DHS Office of Inspector General, between fiscal year 2014 and 16, personnel from DHS and its components misplaced a total of 2,142 highly sensitive assets, including 228 firearms and 1,889 badges. The report highlights a troubling trend with how DHS employees safeguard sensitive assets. As chairman of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Management Efficiency, I sent letters to both the U.S. Secret Service and the U.S. Customs and Border Protection last year expressing my concerns over data showing high numbers of lost or stolen assets in recent years. Having served in the military for over 3 decades, the importance of maintaining accountability of mission-critical equipment cannot be overstated. It is no different at DHS. These episodes indicate a lack of accountability and emphasis on taxpayer property and sensitive item accountability, and that is unacceptable. Given the importance of the DHS mission, this is completely unsatisfactory and intolerable. H.R. 4433 will address this issue by requiring the Undersecretary for Management to compile and disseminate to DHS employees the Safeguarding Firearms and Sensitive Assets Directive, a department-wide directive aimed at achieving security over firearms and other sensitive assets. H.R. 4433 mandates that the directive include descriptions of what equipment is classified as a sensitive asset, requirements for securing sensitive assets, and record-keeping requirements for reporting lost or stolen firearms and other assets. This legislation will also require DHS to update its Personal Property Asset Management Program Manual to include procedures and training on how to safeguard assets both on and off duty. H.R. 4433 follows recommendations from the DHS OIG and is a positive step forward towards training DHS employees on how to properly handle sensitive equipment. I urge all members to join me in supporting this legislation to hold DHS personnel more accountable and to safeguard DHS's mission-critical assets. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion? I now call up H.R. 4577, the Domestic Explosives Detection Canine Capacity Building Act of 2017. Bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. Clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 4577.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with and the bill is considered read and open to amendment. At any point, I now recognize the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Rogers, for 5 minutes on his bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've long advocated canines as a mobile and effective explosives detection asset. This committee has conducted dozens of hearings, briefings, and site visits to airports and transit hubs. The one word that comes up consistently is canines. Unfortunately, ISIS-inspired attacks on soft targets around the world have driven demand for these incredible animals through the roof. The Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Defense jointly sourced most of their dogs from vendors in Europe. Over the last decade, DOD and DHS have purchased thousands of canines from a handful of European vendors while taking less than 100 dogs per year from domestic suppliers. American canine breeders and vendors produce some of the finest working dogs in the world, but they are vastly underrepresented in government contracting. These companies are generally small businesses that don't have the time or resources to navigate DHS's arcane procurement rules. I believe DHS, particularly TSA, has not done enough to get domestic suppliers on board. Earlier this year, the American Kennel Club, leading veterinarians, working dog experts came together with one goal: connect American working dogs with American national security. This legislation is based on those expert findings and this committee's diligent oversight work. The working group established by this bill will lay the groundwork for a national explosives detection breeding and training network using the latest veterinary science. I'm confident that American canine companies can improve working dog effectiveness, better canine health, and lay the groundwork for massive improvements in DHS procurement processes. I'd like to thank my colleagues on the committee for their support in this bill, and I'm proud that we have bipartisan support in this important issue. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the bill? Ms. Watson-Coleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment that I'd like to have considered.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry. The clerk shall designate the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4577, offered by Mrs. Watson-Coleman.
Ms. Watson-Coleman, will the gentlelady like to offer her amendment?
Yes, I would, Mr.
Okay, the gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would improve the underlying bill in a few ways. First, it would require the TSA administrator to consult with other DHS components, including the Science and Technology Directorate, Customs and Border Protection, and Secret Service, to incorporate mission needs across the department for an expanded domestic explosives detection canine breeding network. This provision will ensure components work together to leverage resources and to optimize operations. Second, my amendment preserves the TSA administrator's authority to have the final word on appropriate behavioral, medical, and technical standards for explosives detection canines. While the input of the working group established by the bill should help enhance TSA's canine operations, it is imperative that the TSA administrator, who has had a more complete picture of the threats faced in TSA's screening operations, has the final say regarding what canine resources are sought. My amendment will ensure that TSA maintains the flexibility to adjust standards as necessary to respond to the latest threats. Finally, my amendment makes two technical changes to the requirements for the working group. It would require there to be two chairpersons to leading the working group, one from the private sector and one from the public sector. My amendment also would sunset the working group 2 years after the TSA administrator submits a strategy to Congress to expand the domestic canine breeding network. This provision will help ensure that the working group can contribute to the successful implementation of the TSA policy and help enhance the availability critical canine screening resources. Mr. Chairman, my amendment seeks to strengthen this underlying and good bill, and as such, I urge members to support it. And with that, I yield back my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, thank you. General yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Rogers is recognized.
I do believe that the gentlelady's amendment does improve the bill, and I urge its adoption.
Any further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Katko is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to echo the sentiments of my colleagues on Ms. Watson-Coleman and Mr. Rogers. I think for far too long, TSA has underutilized and underprioritized the canine program, and I think it's high time that we take control and try and push the canine program further. It's clear from a hearing that Ms. Watson-Coleman and I had recently in New Jersey, a field hearing, that canines are highly desired by the boots on the ground and the front lines. And it's also clear to me that if a canine was in that subway station, train station recently, perhaps the gentleman that came in, the bomber, could have been detected. So I think that it's high time that we get this program right. It's high time that we make sure that TSA and Homeland Security have standards for breeding that are not a moving target, and that they can give breeders some sense of comfort that if they expand their programs, that they're not going to move the goalposts. So I highly applaud this bill, and I hope for its passage, quick and swift passage. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by Ms. Watson-Coleman. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. There are no other amendments listed on the roster. Are there any other amendments to the bill? Before we go to the bill itself, I want to commend Mr. Rogers for bringing this bill forward. I think canines are probably the best detection that we have. I think after the Inspector General briefed this committee in a classified setting, all of us here recognize how important this is to the safety of the American people, both not only in the subway system, as we saw in New York, but also in flying aircraft and airplanes from abroad into the United States, but also domestically. I would also urge the Secretary, as I drafted a letter to her, to move forward with the latest technology that's available, going from X-ray to computer tomography or CT scanning. Until we do this and deploy as many canines as possible, I think we're putting the American public at risk on airplanes. With that being said, hearing no other amendments, the question now occurs on agreeing to the bill, H.R. 4577, as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. The question now occurs on reporting the bill, H.R. 4577, as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. I now call up H.R. 1486, the Securing American Nonprofit Organization Against Terrorism Act of 2017. Bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 1486.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. Bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. An amendment in the nature of a substitute has been offered by the gentleman from Mississippi. Mr. Thompson, does the gentleman wish to offer his amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute listed on the roster and ask for his consideration at this time.
The clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1486, offered by Mr. Thompson.
Without objection, reading is dispensed with, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered base text. For purposes of amendment, the amendment in the nature of a substitute was noticed in compliance with the committee rules. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Mississippi for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I mentioned in my opening statement, this timely bill seeks to ensure that DHS continues to be a valuable partner to nonprofits that are at risk of a terrorist attack. As places of public gathering without extensive security protection, churches and other houses of worship are generally considered soft targets, much like shopping malls, restaurants, stores, and theaters. Regrettably, the volume of homegrown violent extremist threats to houses of worship and other nonprofit has grown significantly over the past year, particularly against synagogues and mosques. But the threat to nonprofit institutions is not new and is not limited to big cities. In 2015, a man trying to start a race war murdered 9 parishioners in a mass shooting at the AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. In 2012, a white supremacist opened fire at a Sikh temple in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, killing 6 people. Because attacks against houses of worship transcend the existing geographic boundaries of the Department's Urban Area Security Initiative program, my legislation directs FEMA to make available $15 million to at-risk institutions outside UASIs. This legislation was included in the DHS authorization bill that the committee advanced earlier this year. It sends a message of support to nonprofit organizations across the country that homegrown extremists and others with violent ideologies seek to attack. Our rich religious and cultural diversity is what makes America great. We need to nurture and guard it, particularly at the time of heightened threat. With that, I urge yes on my amendment and the underlying bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the amendment in the nature of a substitute? I just would like to offer my support for this amendment as well.
Mr. Chairman?
Oh, sorry, Mr. Longevin.
I have an amendment to...
Oh, you have an amendment to this?
Yes.
No, I don't think we're there yet.
Okay. Oh,
it's not in order right now.
Okay.
So, again, I'd like to reiterate my support for this amendment in the nature of substitute. As the gentleman from Mississippi correctly pointed out, FEMA administers this nonprofit grant program to houses of worship, hospitals, schools, and community centers, but the problem is those outside of UOC jurisdiction cannot receive these grants. For example, in my own district, we had a Jewish community center that received bomb threats and other types of threats, and we have Jewish community centers across the country that have received these threats that are outside UOC jurisdiction. And I think this amendment would authorize $50 million for this program, a 100% increase over last year's appropriated levels. Yeah, I know with the current threat environment, this is very much in order, and I want to thank the gentleman for bringing this amendment to our attention. There being any further discussion on this amendment? There being no further discussion of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, the committee will move to consideration of the amendments on the roster. Per the roster agreement listed first as an amendment offered by the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Longevin. Would the gentleman like to offer his amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I have an amendment at the desk.
And the clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1486, offered by Mr. Langevin.
Mr. Longevin is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would ensure that the resources that the ranking member has proposed to protect at-risk nonprofits from terrorism can be used to harden against cybersecurity threats as well. and I commend Ranking Member Thompson for offering the bill in the first place. Today, terrorists no longer have to be physically near the victims to cause damage and destruction. As such, religious organizations, minority-serving institutions, and other nonprofits can face destructive digital attacks, such as the electronic Holocaust attempted against Jewish organizations by the Middle Eastern contingent of the hacking group Anonymous in 2015. These targeted nonprofits may also be small in nature, with limited financial resources and cybersecurity expertise. When faced with a determined malicious actor, they may not have the capacity to adequately defend their digital property. With destructive malware, such as the WannaCry and NotPetya worms on the rise, these organizations could face substantial harm to their missions, including the digital destruction of their data and their information technology, or having this data held hostage for ransomware. As with other forms of terrorism, cyber intrusions may also be used to enhance more traditional physical attacks, perhaps by stealing information relating to security planning or exfiltrating the personal data of nonprofit personnel. We owe it to our constituents to not only do all we can to protect the physical community centers and nonprofit organizations that allow Americans to safely congregate, worship, or engage in other community activities, but also to do all we can to protect the extension of these activities into cyberspace. As such, I offer this amendment to H.R. 1486 to modify the grant program proposed by the ranking member to explicitly allow cybersecurity resilience activities under the allowed funding. I commend Ranking Member Thompson for his leadership in this program and for his work to extend it to targets outside of UASI jurisdictions, and I strongly support the underlying ANS. So I believe my amendment will help strengthen the program further by preparing it for emerging threats in cyberspace, and I urge my colleagues to support it and the underlying bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment? I'm very supportive of the gentleman's amendment and always bring his expertise on cybersecurity to this committee. There being no further discussion, question now occurs on the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the gentleman from Rhode Island. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. There are no other amendments listed on the roster. Are there any other amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Hearing none, the question now occurs on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1486 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. Question now occurs on reporting the bill H.R. 1486 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion is laid to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. I now call up H.R. 4567, the DHS Overseas Personnel Enhancement Act of 2017. The bill is circulated in advance. Printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 4567.
Without objection, reading is dispensed with, and the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko, is recognized for 5 minutes on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Recently, I had the privilege of leading a bipartisan congressional delegation to Europe and the Middle East, where my committee colleagues and I saw firsthand the critical work being done by the Department of Homeland Security personnel overseas. Their efforts to build relationships with foreign partners, coordinate with other federal agencies, and secure our homeland from threats before they arrive on our shores are truly a testament to the vital counterterror mission of DHS and the need to ensure the effectiveness and efficiency of our overseas programs. However, I also observe that even today, more than 15 years after 9/11, federal agencies still struggle to successfully share information and collaborate with each other. It is imperative that DHS personnel stationed overseas serve as an effective force multiplier for their federal counterparts, and federal agencies act in concert to mitigate threats to the American people and American interests. Moreover, we must ensure that DHS personnel stationed overseas be deployed in a manner that is risk-based. My legislation takes observations from our delegation and codifies requirements to make DHS overseas personnel more effective and better equipped. This bill provides much-needed transparency to the training provided to these individuals, as well as how their deployment and roles directly contribute to the counterterror mission of the Department of Homeland Security. Additionally, my bill will allow us to understand what hindrances exist to effective information sharing among DHS personnel and how we can break down barriers to better address evolving threats to the United States. The first role of government is to protect its citizens, and it is incumbent upon those of us in Congress, particularly those of us on this committee, to ensure that America's preeminent counterterrorism agencies are doing all they can to respond to changing threats, share information effectively, and build counterterrorism capacity among our foreign partners. The starkness of the challenges facing the men and women of DHS to accomplish our mission was made clear to me and my committee colleagues on our recent trip. And I hope they know just how much we appreciate all their tireless efforts to protect the homeland. I appreciate the bipartisan support of Ranking Member Watson-Coleman of this bill and look forward to continuing our work together on these and other issues. I urge all my colleagues to support this important legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the bill? There being no further discussion on the bill, the committee will move to consideration of the amendments on the roster. Per the roster agreement listed first is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson. Would the gentleman like to offer his amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk and wish to have it considered at this time.
Clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4567, offered by Mr. Thompson.
Without objection, reading is dispensed with. The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my amendment seeks to build upon the committee's ongoing efforts to bolster DHS overseas operation. Last year, Congress enacted legislation that this committee, on a bipartisan basis, approved to direct the Secretary of Homeland Security to issue the strategy for the department's international programs. Among other things, the law required DHS to provide the committee with an inventory of personnel and resources deployed abroad and a 3-year risk-based strategy to more effectively and more efficiently deploy overseas assets. The statutory deadline, however, for the strategy was June 2017, 6 months ago. To date, the critical strategy has not been submitted to Congress as required. I'm pleased that this bill before us today, as introduced by Representative Katko, seeks to build on my legislation and help enhance DHS's efforts to push out our borders. My amendment would modify the underlying bill by expanding the bill's briefing requirements to once the long-awaited strategy is issued, covering information on DHS's efforts to implement the strategy. Adoption of my amendment will ensure that the plans DHS shares with Congress are actually followed. Considering their delinquency in delivering this critical strategy, implementation language in this bill is something we should demand. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment and the underlying bill, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Katko is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I fully support the amendment, and I urge passage along with the bill.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the amendments? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Mississippi. All is in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
All is opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Per the roster agreement, listed next is an amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
I'm going to offer the amendment on her behalf, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Langevin is recognized to offer the amendment.
Ms. Jackson
And
Lee
the
has
clerk,
the
I'm sorry,
amendment.
the clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4567, offered by Mr. Langevin.
Without objection, reading is dispensed with. The gentleman from Rhode Island is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On behalf of Ms. Jackson Lee, I'm proud to offer this amendment. Both she and I want to thank Congressman Katko for bringing H.R. 4567, the DHS Overseas Personnel Enhancement Act, before the full committee for consideration. H.R. 4567 requires the Department of Homeland Security to develop an overseas personnel assessment and enhancement strategy. The bill addresses the placement of DHS personnel abroad in an effort to address the foreign fighter threat. My amendment that I'm offering on behalf of Ms. Jackson Lee adds a requirement that DHS personnel be properly trained to identify and resist tactics used by intelligence agencies to recruit or compromise DHS staff. We know from the report background, again, open quote, background to assessing Russian activities and intentions in recent U.S. elections. The analytic process and cyber incident attribution provided by the Office of Director of National Intelligence Council that Russia targeted our presidential elections. The report also made it clear that Russia was not finished with its attempts to undermine our democracy or our government institutions. Russia does not share our value of democracy, liberty, or the precious freedom that we hold dear. Our nation must be vigilant in its efforts to protect our interests and our institutions. The Russian General Staff Main Intelligence Directorate, or the GRU, is suspected by our intelligence agencies of having begun cyber operations targeting the United States election as early as March 2016. The Russians will not hesitate to pursue other opportunities to cause our nation difficulties, and that includes targeting DHS personnel who may be stationed abroad. This amendment accepts this potential threat and provides statutory language to allow the Secretary of DHS to prepare personnel that may be stationed abroad. I thank the committee for adoption of these legislative improvements, and I look forward to working with my colleagues on the committee to further strengthen the Department's efforts abroad so that it is prepared to meet all threats. I ask the members of the committee to support the Jackson Lee Amendment to H.R. 4567 and the DHS Overseas Personnel Enhancement Act, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Kaka is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Briefly, I fully support this amendment as well and urge its passage.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment? I, too, offer my support for this amendment. I think it was very clear when the ranking member and I received the Gang of Eight briefing last October that the Russians attempted to influence the elections. To me, it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or Democrat. That's an affront to our democracy. And I think we should all stand strong against what Russia has been doing. I think there's no question that Russia will attempt to influence our elections, probably in the 2018 election cycle as well. I think this committee should maintain its oversight responsibilities on this issue as well. There being no further discussion, the question now occurs in the amendment offered by the gentleman from Rhode Island. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. There are no other amendments listed on the roster. Are there any further amendments to the bill? Hearing none, the question now occurs on agreeing to the bill H.R. 4567 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is agreed to. Question now occurs on reporting the bill H.R. 4567 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion reconsidered is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. I now call up H.R. 4559, the Global Aviation System Security Reform Act of 2017. The bill was circulated in advance, and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 4559.
Without objection, reading is dispensed with. Bills considered read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Estes, for 5 minutes.
As you know, I represent the 4th Congressional District of Kansas. Within my district is the heart of America's general aviation. Wichita, Kansas is known as the air capital of the world. This means I get the opportunity to meet with stakeholders at all levels and professions in the aviation industry. One common thread of all these meetings is a commitment to safety and security and how to address the issues that are still over the horizon. Today I'm introducing H.R. 4559, the Global Aviation System Security Reform Act of 2017, to address these issues. On my trip to Europe and the Middle East, led by Transportation and Protective Security Subcommittee Chairman Katko, I found this commitment to safety and security was shared across multiple countries and security agencies. Because of this shared interest in addressing the next threat to our skies, we should be taking every chance we get to collaborate with our counterparts overseas, especially the ones at the last departure airports. Our common enemies all share their commitment to exploit vulnerabilities, and we must meet this with our own determined and united security posture. For example, our German partners have in place a robust and comprehensive strategy for screening passengers, and more importantly, as of late, aviation workers. As the delegation examined current threats to aviation security and the measures the Germans have taken, I began to see multiple points of best practices and standard operating procedures that we could greatly benefit from learning more about. Therefore, it's imperative that we give the Transportation Security Administration a robust mandate to collaborate and report back to this committee new best practices for, 1, collaborating with foreign partners to improve our security postures, 2, identifying foreign partners that are not meeting security protocols from the International Civil Aviation Organization or the Department of Homeland Security, 3, improving the development, outreach, and implementation process for security directives issued to domestic and foreign air carriers, and 4, assessing the cybersecurity and cyber espionage risk of security screening equipment. By passing this bill and creating a global aviation security task force within the TSA, we will be in the best position we can be to address the over-the-horizon threat and close gaps between our global security partners. I thank the committee and their staff for giving me the opportunity to do what I came to Congress to do, make America safe and more secure. I urge all of my colleagues to support H.R. 4559. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the bill?
Mr. Chairman.
Echo is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief. I just want to reiterate that this is another bill that has its origins in our overseas congressional delegation, and it was by talking with our partners in Germany as well as other areas, and I fully support the bill and urge its passage. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the bill? There being no further discussion, the committee will move to consideration of the amendments on the roster. Per the roster agreement, listed first is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin. Would the gentleman like to offer his amendment?
Yes, amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4559, offered by Mr. Langevin.
Without objection, reading is dispensed with. Mr. Langevin is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you well know, since we work so closely on the issue of cybersecurity, cybersecurity risks are increasingly threatening the safety of and trust in our air transportation system. Under your leadership, this committee has done an excellent job of raising the profile of what I consider to be the preeminent national and economic security challenge of the 21st century, and is taking substantive steps to address this issue. Earlier this week, the full House passed the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency Act, which recognizes the operational role played by the National Protection and Programs Directorate by elevating it to an independent agency. Notably, the bill also recognizes the need to incorporate cybersecurity into all hazards planning, rather than siloing it as an independent area of risk. From my work on the House Armed Services Committee, I can say with certainty that every conflict going forward in the world today is going forward will have a cybersecurity component associated with it. We should expect that terrorist threats will increasingly be cross-domain as well. I say all of this, Mr. Chairman, as a preface to my amendment, which will ensure that cybersecurity threats are included in the review of global aviation system security standards. Despite acting as the sector-specific agency for the transportation sector, TSA has focused on protecting against traditional physical attacks. As aviation, like the rest of our economy, becomes more and more wired, I hope TSA will expand its nascent cybersecurity efforts in order to ensure that we can continue to fly safely and that Americans remain trusting of air travel. My amendment takes a first step toward this goal by requiring that the standards review does not neglect cybersecurity. I think it's a small but important change, and I urge my colleagues to support it. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by Mr. Langevin. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. There are no other amendments listed on the roster. Are there any other amendments to the bill? Hearing none, the question now occurs on agreeing to the bill H.R. 4559 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. Question now occurs on reporting the bill H.R. 4559 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. I now call up H.R. 4561, the Safe Tech Act. Bill was circulated in advance. Printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 4561.
Without objection, reading is dispensed with. The bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I mentioned previously, Ranking Member Watson-Coleman, Mr. Estes, Mr. Vella, and Mr. Bilirakis recently joined me on a congressional delegation to examine aviation security at last point of departure airports. Over the course of our trip, we consistently heard the urgency of getting cutting-edge technology into airports as quickly as possible. This piece of legislation we are considering today, championed by my esteemed colleague, Mr. Bilirakis, directs the administrator to establish a program and framework for enabling third-party testing for advanced security screening technologies in order to alleviate existing bureaucratic hurdles and bottlenecks in TSA's testing and evaluation process. By way of example, I will note that at Schiphol Airport, within a few months, they ordered American technology for 3D screening that we're being told by TSA is going to take a couple of years to implement. This legislation will increase efficiencies, decrease costs, but most importantly, it will fast-track the acquisitions and procurement process and make it easier for small businesses to gain access to testing. Finally, this bill seeks to align various security standards and protocols with the European Civil Aviation Conference in order to streamline international security standards and raise the global baseline of aviation security. In October, as I mentioned, we visited Amsterdam Schiphol Airport, which has more advanced technology in airports than we do. We can and should do better, and I applaud Congressman Bilirakis' efforts in this, on this issue, and as a member of this committee, his knowledge and insight on this issue is invaluable as a former member. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of this legislation, and I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this bill. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back in for a discussion on the amendment, or on the bill. There being no further discussion, the committee will move to consideration of the amendments on the roster. Per the roster agreement, listed first is the amendment offered by the gentleman from Mississippi. Mr. Thompson, would the gentleman like to offer his amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk and wish to have it considered at this time.
Clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4561, offered by Mr. Thompson.
Without objection, reading is dispensed with. Mr. Thompson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, my amendment adds two important protections to ensure the third-party technology testing program created under this bill operates as intended. First, my amendment requires that any entity providing third-party testing under this bill is owned and controlled by a United States citizen. At a time when Americans are rightly concerned about foreign interference in government operations, it is common sense to require that companies playing a central role in the qualification process for security technologies be owned by a United States citizen. This language mirrors requirements already in statute with respect to firms that seek to provide screening services under the Screening Partnership Program. The second protection is focused on ensuring that integrity is built into the program. Specifically, it would require the TSA administrator to ensure that an entity providing third-party testing does not have a contractual or other business interest in the technology being tested or the vendor providing the technology. Again, just common sense. We must ensure that companies carrying out the testing of security equipment are operating above board. My amendment supports the intent of the underlying bill while ensuring it does not create opportunities for waste, fraud, or abuse. I'd note my amendment includes feedback from TSA and the Security Manufacturers Coalition. As a result, a refinement was included to underscore the intent of the bill. I thank them for the engagement on my amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Katko is ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The goal of Mr. Bilirakis' bill is to help alleviate the bottlenecks at Homeland Security and TSA that currently prevent small businesses and startups from having their screening equipment tested and validated due to the unacceptable length of time it takes to go through the process. Industry has reached out to my staff and indicated that at least one small woman-owned business has expressed concerns with the text of the amendment as it may possibly jeopardize existing contracts with TSA and other stakeholders. Well, overall, the industry is very supportive of the bill, and I think of the amendment, and I am as well, Mr. Thompson's amendment. There are some possible issues that might need to be tweaked with respect to the amendment, and I think the issues haven't been come up because there was a time constraint, I think, in their ability to review it. With that being said, we understand that some of these concerns were already addressed, as Mr. Thompson has noted, and they are prepared to support the amendment as well, provided that the minority can commit to working on potential future minor modifications to language containing in this amendment should additional concerns arise. And so with that, I ask the ranking member if he can commit to working with me on the text being added by this amendment before proceeding to the floor if it's minor in nature, should additional concerns arise. And I would be prepared to support this adoption today and would urge my colleagues to vote yes if you could agree to that.
That's reasonable. I agree.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. And with that, I fully support the amendment.
I like that bipartisan support. Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by Mr. Thompson. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Next on the roster agreement is an amendment offered by the gentlelady from California, Ms. Berrigan. Would the gentlelady like to offer her amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk and wish to have it considered at this time.
The clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4561, offered by Ms. Berrigan.
Without objection, reading is dispensed with. Ms. Berrigan is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The underlying bill directs TSA to establish a new platform for transportation security technology to be tested. Recently, I had the opportunity to see TSA's impressive transportation systems integration facility and appreciate the rigorous approach that TSA takes to testing screening technologies. My amendment would require the Government Accountability Office to review the third-party testing program that TSA is directed to create under this bill. Specifically, my amendment directs GAO to, among other things, take a look at the impacts of the program on the availability of new and novel technology, the robustness of TSA's oversight of the program, and any vulnerabilities created under the testing program. This GAO review will help Congress know whether this new testing program is operating as intended. Adoption of my amendment would ensure that 2 years after enactment, the third-party testing program receives a fair review on which members of Congress can rely to gauge program success. For these reasons, I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment?
Yes, we fully support the amendment. It's a good idea, and it's good governance, good oversight, and I urge its passage.
The gentleman yields back. Any further discussion? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by Ms. Berrigan. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. There are no other amendments listed on the roster. Are there any other amendments to the bill? Hearing none, the question now occurs on agreeing to the bill, H.R. 4561 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is agreed to. Question now occurs on reporting the bill, H.R. 4561, as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Garrett's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for this sort of unconventional recognition. I want to speak briefly to H.R. 4433, which we've already passed through in block. I failed to exploit the brief opportunity to speak to it then, and I appreciate the indulgence of the committee. H.R. 4433 seeks to impose accountability requirements on individuals in the Department of Homeland Security to address the loss of sensitive items to include over 200 firearms in this period of 2 years. But ironically, I am drawn to the Bible verse, Matthew 7:3, which says, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye?" Because, Mr. Chairman, about 7 years ago, we learned that the Department of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and the Project Gunrunner operation gave nearly 10 times as many weapons, not handguns, not service weapons, but military-style weapons to a band of murderous thugs across our southern border in Mexico. When the patron, Mr. Correa, made reference to an individual who was killed by one of the weapons lost by DHS, I would submit that if that is the extent of the damage, the death toll from the weapons intentionally given by our government in Fast and Furious outstrips that by a factor of 69 to 1. In fact, one of those deaths was the death of Border Patrol agent Brian Terry, which ironically will mark the 7th anniversary of tomorrow. And so while I have no objection to the idea that we should ensure accountability at the Department of Homeland Security as it relates to their sensitive items to include weapons and badges, I wonder what this committee will do to address the real threat to Homeland Security and the very lives of our brothers and sisters, American citizens like Brian Terry, who was murdered in part by a gentleman who was deported from this nation 7 times prior to shooting Mr. Terry in the back and allowing him to bleed to death on American soil as Terry sought to chase down a band of armed thugs who were exploiting the very illegal immigrants who Mr. Terry was charged with protecting this nation from by robbing them. That is correct. Agent Terry was murdered with weapons provided with intent by the United States government while protecting people who sought to enter this country illegally. And so it's my curiosity, rhetorically, if we can take the plank out of our own eye before we worry about the splinter in our brothers. I support the concept of H.R. 4433, but it strikes me that while I wore the uniform of the United States, I didn't need an act of Congress to ensure that my soldiers didn't lose their weapons, and if they did, we had a protocol by which they would be disciplined and probably removed from service. I wonder if that's the case in the instance of individuals who lose their weapons and badges. And I wonder if we can count on the fact that over 8 times as many weapons were lost in a far shorter period of time on this day before the anniversary of the needless death of an American hero, Brian Terry, to inspire the same sort of bipartisan cooperation that we saw in this bill from our colleagues, most of whom walked out of the room when Attorney General Eric Holder was held in contempt of Congress, resulting in no punishment for failing to turn over documents on this matter. So, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your indulgence. I simply submit that while this is a good bill, there are bigger problems to be addressed. And so long as I'm on this committee, I won't let the massive problem be ignored while the small problem is addressed. There is still an investigation that needs to be done, and the loss of American life and life abroad far outstrips that from the problem that we addressed today. Mr. Chairman, again, I thank you for your time. I'd conclude my remarks with a thanks to the family and friends and co-workers of Special Agent Brian Terry, who laid down his life not just protecting Americans, but protecting those who sought to enter this country illegally from a band of armed thugs carrying weaponry given to them by our very government, and submit that I hope one day on this earth and not in the next life there will be justice. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. This concludes consideration of the bills noticed by the committee for today. Chair recognizes Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Pursuant to Rule 22, Clause 1 of the Rules of the House, I move that the committee authorize the chairman to offer such motions as may be necessary in the House to go to conference with the Senate on the bills reported by this committee today or on similar Senate bills.
Without objection, the motion is agreed to. Now, ranking members recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I ask that members have 2 calendar days to file with the clerk of the committee supplemental, additional, or minority views on each of the bills ordered reported by the committee today.
Without objection, so ordered. I'd just like to comment as we conclude this proceeding that this committee has passed out of this committee over 80 bills, which I think is more than possibly any other committee in the House. This year, 62 of these bills passed the House. 4 of those were signed into public law. Unfortunately, 55 of those bills are stuck and are languishing in the Senate taking no action. The reauthorization bill and our cyber bill that passed this week, I hope that the Senate will take up action on these 55 bills, but particularly those two that I mentioned that are utmost importance to the department. I spoke with the secretary, the newly confirmed secretary, just yesterday, who voiced her strong opinion that the Senate take action on these bills, and I hope they will do so. Now, with that, there being no further business to transact, the committee now stands adjourned.